Mark sat in the far corner of the bar, a sanctuary of shadows and muted sounds, nursing his drink as he stared into the amber liquid. The dim lighting wrapped around him like a shroud, offering a brief reprieve from the weight of memories that haunted him. Once a proud cop, he now found solace in anonymity, away from the scrutiny of former colleagues and the world that carried on without him. The weight of unresolved guilt pulsed in his chest, echoing each time he recalled the moment that irrevocably altered the course of his life, a moment etched in time, buried beneath layers of regret. Around him, laughter and chatter drifted through the air, but to Mark, it felt like background noise in a film playing out without him. He had come to expect this isolation. It was both a refuge and a prison. Ghosts from his past lingered, flickering at the edges of his consciousness while he tried to drink them away one glass at a time. But as he took another sip, savoring a fleeting sense of calm, that fragile silence shattered. A grizzled voice sliced through the low hum, rich with bitter familiarity. "Well, look who finally thinks he's somebody." Mark's heart sank as he turned to face the speaker. It was an older man with a face worn by years on the force, familiar yet distant. Recognition dawned only when a name slipped from the man's lips like an accusation. Suddenly, Mark was pulled back into history he had hoped to escape. This wasn't simple bar talk. This was unfinished business, payback for a choice made decades ago during an ordinary bust that spiraled into chaos. In that instant, under the watchful eyes of off-duty officers scattered throughout the bar, Mark understood. This meeting would not bring closure but rather ignite a reckoning long avoided. The bar was an eclectic mix of muted colors and half-lit faces, where shadows danced across worn wooden tables. The hushed conversations ebbed and flowed like the tide, creating a backdrop of familiarity and camaraderie among the patrons, all off-duty officers who shared an unspoken bond forged through years on the force. They exchanged stories, laughter occasionally punctuating the air, yet for Mark, it felt like being encased in glass. Though surrounded by men who once stood shoulder to shoulder with him, he felt invisible, trapped in his own thoughts while the world continued around him. Each clink of glasses and murmur carried an intimacy that Mark found both comforting and suffocating. It was a soundscape that reminded him of the unity he once cherished but now served only as a reminder of what he had lost. The decor was a tapestry of faded police memorabilia, accolades celebrating valor and bravery, yet all they did was amplify his sense of guilt. Here, in this sanctuary of former comrades, Mark could not escape the ghosts of his past. They lingered at the edges of his vision, just beyond reach. As he sipped his drink, he observed their interactions with feigned indifference. Laughter erupted every few minutes from a group clustering around a pool table, their camaraderie palpable and genuine, contrasting sharply with his own solitude. They were friends reliving memories and making new ones, tales of glory or mischief shared without hesitation. Meanwhile, Mark remained an outsider in his own life story. It was in this fragile atmosphere that the once comforting silence lurked like a predator. Just when he believed he could sink deeper into obscurity, the grizzled voice cut through everything, breaking through his isolation with sharp reality and inviting both confrontation and reckoning in equal measure. Just as Mark settled deeper into his drink, attempting to blend into the background, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter and chatter that had enveloped him like a warm blanket suddenly grew tense, as if the entire bar collectively held its breath. It was then that the grizzled voice sliced through the air, bold and accusatory. "Well, look who finally thinks he's somebody." The room's energy morphed instantaneously, eyes shifting towards the source of the interruption. Mark felt the weight of every gaze upon him, but it was the voice that commanded his attention. He turned slowly, his heart racing as he faced the man who had conjured memories he had worked hard to bury. The retired cop's face was lined with age and experience, a map of a life spent in service, yet there was an unmistakable fire behind his weary eyes. Every inch of the bar seemed to lean in closer, curiosity mingling with apprehension as patrons whispered among themselves. This wasn't just idle banter, it was a challenge rooted in unhealed wounds. Mark's mind raced, trying to place this man, someone who embodied the burdens of forgotten histories and unfinished business. Recognition flickered within him as the name emerged from the cop's lips like a ghost returning from the shadows of the past. A ripple of tension washed over the crowd, each person sensing the gravity of the moment as they exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, eager to witness any confrontation, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, acutely aware that they were witnessing a reckoning. For Mark, time seemed to crawl as adrenaline surged through him, intertwining fear and defiance. He could feel the old man's need for revenge simmering beneath the surface, and Mark braced himself for what was coming next, a confrontation that promised to unravel everything he thought he had left behind. As the old cop's words settled in the air, a shiver ran down Mark's spine. The name that followed, Dale Mercer, struck him like a lightning bolt, illuminating a dark corner of his past he thought long buried. Memories surged forth, raw and vivid, each one flooding him with guilt and regret. Dale had been more than just a fellow officer. He had been Mark's mentor, a man whose career was irrevocably altered by a split-second decision during a routine bust gone awry. Mark recalled the chaotic night vividly, the adrenaline, the tension in the air, and how everything spiraled out of control in an instant. A misjudgment made by a rookie cop led to an explosion of events that left Dale sidelined and struggling to rebuild his life. Mark had watched helplessly as Dale's promising career crumbled under the weight of blame and humiliation, while he himself was left to navigate the conflicting feelings of loyalty and guilt. The bar was now alive with whispers and sideways glances as patrons sensed the palpable shift in Mark's demeanor. He could feel their eyes darting between him and the old cop, measuring the gravity of this confrontation. The old man's gaze bore into him, fueled by years of resentment and unacknowledged pain. This was no mere chance encounter, it was an accusation wrapped in a demand for accountability. Mark's breath quickened as he faced his past head-on, realizing that the man before him sought not only confrontation but perhaps some form of closure, for himself as much as for Mark. Yet what lay ahead was uncertain. Mark knew all too well that unresolved histories could lead to either redemption or revenge, and he stood at the precipice of both. As he braced for what would come next, every heartbeat echoed with the weight of choices long made and their inevitable consequences now surfacing once again. In that charged moment, Mark's mind spiraled back to the fateful night that had changed everything. He found himself standing at the edge of a rain-soaked street, blue and red lights flashing in chaotic patterns against the darkened sky. It was a routine bust, or so they thought, an ordinary call that spiraled into a nightmare for everyone involved. The excitement coursed through him. He was young, eager, and hungry for action as he pulled on a pair of gloves, ready to prove himself. Dale Mercer had been there beside him, calm and assured, guiding Mark as they prepared to confront what they believed was a simple drug dealer. Mark remembered how Dale had whispered instructions in his ear, steadying him with a firm hand on his shoulder before they approached the door. But when it swung open, things went south in an instant. Adrenaline surged as faces morphed from surprise to hostility. In that critical moment, Mark made a split-second decision, pushing forward without waiting for backup and shouting commands that only seemed to amplify the chaos. Gunfire erupted like thunderclaps, and Mark's heart raced as he instinctively ducked for cover. In the frenzy, Dale had stood his ground, shielding another officer who had been caught off guard. A shot rang out and Mark's vision blurred as he realized Dale hadn't just protected their squadmate, he'd sacrificed his own safety to do so. The aftermath was devastating. Mark witnessed Dale being carried away on a stretcher, his career seriously compromised by injuries sustained that night, all because of Mark's reckless decision. Destiny had shifted irrevocably for both men, one thrust into a dark spiral of ostracization and regret while the other navigated the haunting guilt that arose from knowing he had altered a mentor's fate forever. As these memories crashed over him like waves, Mark felt anchored by their weight just as the old cop's eyes bore into him, full of pain and demand for reckoning. Now it was clear, this encounter would force him to revisit more than just their shared history, it would compel him to confront his own culpability head-on. The air in the bar was thick with anticipation as Mark faced the old cop, whose expression radiated a mix of resentment and grief. The grizzled man, once a proud member of the force, now stood before Mark marked by years of disappointment and unfulfilled aspirations. "You have no idea what it's like to have your career taken from you," he said, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. The words echoed in Mark's mind, piercing through his defenses. Dale Mercer had been more than a mentor. He was a man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting others, only to have that legacy tarnished by a single reckless choice made one fateful night. The retired cop was not merely seeking a confrontation, it was clear that he yearned for vindication, a way to reclaim the dignity he felt had been stripped from him when everything went wrong. Mark realized that this meeting was as much about Dale's lost career as it was about his own guilt. But there was something else simmering beneath the surface, a desire for revenge that manifested in subtle glints of anger in the old man's eyes. Each time Dale looked at Mark, there was an unspoken accusation layered into the gaze: betrayal. In that moment, Mark understood the duality of what lay ahead. Dale sought acknowledgement of the pain Mark had inadvertently caused him, but also the chance to lash out at the figure associated with his downfall. Mark wrestled with the implications of this revelation. Would Dale confront him to exact revenge for perceived failures? Or would their shared past and Dale's longing for redemption give them an opportunity for something deeper, healing through acknowledgement? Regardless of which path their encounter would forge, Mark felt the stakes were impossibly high as emotions flared and old wounds were laid bare under the bar's dim lights. This wasn't just a reckoning, it was a battle for truth, closure, and possibly even redemption. As the tension hung thick in the air, Mark found himself spiraling deeper into an internal conflict that threatened to swallow him whole. He replayed the events of that fateful night in his mind, contrasting his memories with Dale's fiery accusations. Each moment felt vivid yet heavily clouded by the weight of guilt. He could still hear the echoes of gunfire and see Dale's determined face standing against danger. In Mark's recollection, he had been a rookie eager to impress, a young man striving for acceptance among seasoned officers. He remembered feeling invincible, but now, that bravado felt like an act of reckless foolishness. Dale had been his guiding light, yet he was also a living reminder of Mark's misstep, a decision made out of impulse rather than judgment which had led to irreversible consequences. Dale's perspective seemed unyielding. He painted the picture of betrayal, thrusting Mark's actions into the harsh light of scrutiny. To Dale, it wasn't just a career lost, it was years stolen from his life, marred by shame and regret. How could Mark explain that his own heart had been torn apart by what happened? That every day since that night served as a reminder of his failure? As Mark wrestled with these emotions, he felt torn between wanting to plead his case and recognizing Dale's pain as utterly valid. Could there be room for both acknowledgement of guilt and an offering of understanding? The prospect seemed daunting but essential. The old cop's desire for either redemption or revenge loomed over them like a storm cloud, and Mark realized that this encounter would not only redefine their relationship but would also shape the course of his own healing. There was truth in both their narratives, a shared agony that held the potential for reconciliation if only they could find a way to bridge the chasm between their experiences. What lay ahead hinged on whether they could express their truths without being consumed by anger or hurt. Time was running out. Mark knew that if they didn't confront these buried emotions soon, they might remain forever trapped in shadows of the past. As the intensity of their conversation escalated, the atmosphere in the bar shifted palpably. Nearby patrons, initially engrossed in their own conversations and laughter, began to glance over, drawn in by the palpable tension radiating from Mark and Dale. The once muted chatter faded into whispers, and the air thickened with curiosity as eyes turned toward the reckoning unfolding before them. Mark could feel their stares like a spotlight illuminating his shame, each gaze a reminder of the burden he carried. He fought to maintain his composure, but with every word exchanged between him and Dale, he felt the pressure mount. The retired cop's voice rose above the din of the bar, laden with emotion that demanded attention. "You don't get it, do you? You think you can just walk away from this?" Dale's accusation hung in the air like a challenge, compelling Mark to respond. Mark's heart raced as he searched for words that might bridge the chasm between them. However, each attempt felt feeble against the weight of Dale's sorrow and anger. The spectators in the bar shifted closer, leaning in as if they were witnesses to a trial rather than an emotional confrontation between two men bound by shared history. Among them was an off-duty officer who had long respected both men. He stood frozen at a distance, torn between loyalty to his colleague and empathy for Dale's plight. Others exchanged glances filled with incredulity or intrigue, some even daring to murmur amongst themselves about what might unfold next. The rising tide of emotions encapsulated everyone present. Anticipation hung thick in the air as Mark realized this wasn't simply about him and Dale anymore, it was becoming an event that others wanted to witness. Would this confrontation lead to reconciliation or further division? With every moment that passed, Mark felt trapped in a web of expectations, not only from Dale but also from those who had gathered to watch their exchange unfold. In that charged environment, Every word spoken became more significant than before. As Mark squared his shoulders against both past regrets and present scrutiny, he understood one thing. There would be no easy resolution tonight. Instead, they were teetering on the edge of something monumental, an inevitable clash that could either shatter or transform everything they once knew. As the tension reached a breaking point between Mark and Dale, their words grew sharper, each man laying bare his version of justice in a heated exchange that echoed through the bar. "You think you've moved on, but your choices haunt me every day," Dale accused, his voice rising as the weight of his resentment spilled over. Mark felt the force of that statement hit him like a physical blow. It was a reminder that for every action, there were consequences far-reaching beyond what he had imagined. Mark's heart raced as he fought back. "You don't understand. I was just trying to do my job. I didn't ask for it to end this way." Yet, as he spoke, he could see the recognition in Dale's eyes, a shared understanding of the chaos that had unfolded. Each accusation unveiled layers of hidden truths that had long been buried under regret. The narrative around that night began to shift. It wasn't just Mark's reckless decision that led to Dale's downfall. There had been systemic failures and miscommunications contributing to the tragedy. Dale leaned forward, his voice gravelly yet raw with emotion. "You took everything from me. My dignity, my career, all because you wanted to prove yourself." The pain emanating from Dale was undeniable, yet within his accusations lay an invitation. Could they confront the realities of their past and acknowledge that both had been victims of circumstance? As Mark listened, he could feel the boundaries of his own defenses crumbling. Beneath every vehement word was a longing for understanding and perhaps even reconciliation. The truth they both sought was intertwined, two men caught in a web of failure and pride that meant accepting responsibility for their roles in that dark chapter. The patrons around them shifted uncomfortably as the confrontation unfolded, their gazes flickering between the two men, each feeling the weight of history deepening the divide between them. What began as an argument morphed into an unearthing of secrets long held in silence, hidden resentments and unspoken fears laid bare under a harsh glare. In this crucible of emotions, they stood at a crossroads. Would they continue to fight against one another or find a way to rewrite their shared narrative and reclaim agency over their lives? The path ahead loomed uncertain but transformative. As the conversation intensified, a sudden shift occurred in the atmosphere of the bar. Amidst the charged emotions, Dale's expression shifted, revealing a hint of vulnerability that caught Mark off guard. "You think I blame you for everything that happened? You don't know the whole story," he admitted, his voice tinged with an unexpected softness. The words hung heavily in the air, forcing both men to pause as realization dawned. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, confusion overshadowing his anger. Dale took a deep breath, glancing around at the captivated audience before continuing. "That night wasn't just your fault. There were others involved, people who didn't do their jobs right either." Mark frowned as he recalled details from that chaotic evening but felt lost in the sudden revelation that there had been additional layers to what went wrong. Dale continued, eyes flashing with a mix of regret and certainty. "I had been warned about leaks coming through our department about suspected informants. I couldn't see past my own confidence when we went in." A murmur rippled among the bar patrons as they began to comprehend the implications of this new narrative, one that not only shifted blame but also painted Mark as part of a larger systemic failure. The tension gave way to an environment buzzing with both shock and curiosity. "Are you saying we were set up?" Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, grappling with the realization that perhaps he had not been alone in his folly. That fateful night could have been influenced by forces beyond their control, an idea that rekindled hope but also stirred more questions. Dale nodded slowly, visibly torn between his desire for vindication against the system and his resentment toward Mark for being too blind to see it earlier. This revelation altered everything, igniting an urgent need for answers that transcended their personal conflict. As those words sank in, Mark glanced around at the attentive crowd drawn into their exchange. It became apparent that this altercation held significance beyond just them. It was a reflection of accountability and resilience against a backdrop of shattered lives. In that moment, both men understood they stood on the brink of a collective truth that had the power to change not only their perspectives but possibly even their futures, and others who bore witness to this emotionally charged encounter would take these truths back into their own lives, forever altered by what they had heard. In the aftermath of their explosive confrontation, Mark sat in silence, the vibrant noise of the bar fading into a distant murmur. The adrenaline that had fueled their exchange began to dissipate, leaving behind an unsettling clarity. He could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him, each decision from the past now reverberating in his mind like echoes bouncing off the walls of that very room. For the first time in years, he found himself reflecting on the cascading failures that had stemmed from that ill-fated night. The faces of his fellow officers blurred into a backdrop as memories of Dale's anguish and betrayal played like a film in his head. Mark wrestled with guilt not just towards Dale but also for having contributed to a larger narrative of systemic flaws within their department. He was now acutely aware that his actions had unraveled lives, thrusting him into a cycle of shame he had tried to escape through blind resilience. Yet there lingered a flicker of hope amid despair, the revelation that he wasn't alone, the acknowledgement that forces beyond himself had played a role, opened up new paths for understanding. Perhaps this confrontation could signify not only an ending but also a beginning. He thought about finding ways to repair relationships fractured by time and negligence, not least with Dale. Mark realized he needed personal reconciliation, both for himself and to honor what Dale had once stood for as a mentor. As the bar patrons resumed their muted conversations around him, he felt compelled to call out to Dale once more. In that moment, he understood that true healing would require vulnerability. It meant stepping outside of his own pride and accepting that they could face these demons together. Determined, Mark took a deep breath and stood up, feeling the resolve coursing through him like a surge of fresh air after being submerged too long underwater. He knew what lay ahead wouldn't be easy, it would require courage and honesty. But as he approached Dale again, ready to speak with sincerity about what had transpired, Mark felt for the first time in years that perhaps he was ready to forge a path toward redemption, not just for himself but for both men caught in the wake of such devastating choices. As Mark stepped out of the bar, the cool night air hit him like a refreshing wave, cleansing the remnants of tension that had clung to him. He paused on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath and reflecting on the tumultuous evening that had just unfolded. The confrontation with Dale had been an emotional whirlwind, shaking him to his core as he grappled with truths he had long avoided. The weight of accountability settled heavily on his shoulders. Mark understood now that redemption was not a solitary journey. It required acknowledging the interconnectedness of their lives and recognizing the systemic failures that had contributed to the chaos of that fateful night. He could no longer see himself as just a victim of circumstance, he had played a part in something much larger, and it was time to confront that reality head-on. In the quiet solitude of the street, he contemplated what forgiveness truly meant. It wasn't merely about absolving oneself of guilt but rather accepting responsibility and seeking a path forward. Could he forgive himself for the decisions that had led to Dale's downfall? And could he extend that forgiveness to Dale for his anger and resentment? As these questions swirled in his mind, Mark realized he needed to reach out to Dale once more, not just to mend their relationship but also to find a way to heal the wounds they both carried. There was a profound sense of transformation within him. He felt lighter yet more aware of the burdens that others might carry as well. Mark understood that true reconciliation would take time and effort, but tonight had ignited a spark of hope that perhaps they could forge a new narrative together, one that embraced accountability and sought redemption for both men. As he walked away from the bar, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead in pursuit of healing, not only for himself but for Dale and their shared past. The journey would be long, but at least now he knew he didn't have to face it alone.